This episode is brought to you by 10 Yetis Digital. We started using these guys at the beginning of the year and we've had great results. They're an online public relations agency that manage influencer marketing campaigns, social media campaigns, design. They do design, and they cover sort of multiple sectors, brands big and small. Highly recommended. That's 10yetis.co.uk. Welcome to the Tech Leaders Podcast. I interviewed the CIO of Deliveroo, who have probably been a big part of many people's lockdown experience. Will is a really interesting chap. He went to Cambridge University and jumped straight into, or very quickly after that, jumped into a life of entrepreneurship, learned a ton from that experience. So we break that down. We cover sort of serendipity and entrepreneurship as ever. We also cover some really interesting topics around, went off on a couple of tangents around the democratization of content creation and distribution, and also thinking beyond the restrictive framework of language, which I found fascinating. So yeah, it's a really interesting interview, one that I really enjoyed. So yeah, I hope you enjoy it too. It's Will Sprunt. Will Sprunt, thank you for coming on the Tech Leaders Podcast. I'm really excited about this one. Obviously, Deliveroo are a company who are well known to all of us. Like I was saying to you earlier on, I'm having Deliveroo cyclists pass my house all the time. So the brand's been very in my face recently during this lockdown period. But really excited to find out about yourself and your journey. You've had a fascinating career. So massive thanks for coming on the show. So Will, could you give us a bit of an intro to yourself and a broad overview of your career journey from education to where you are now?
Absolutely. Thanks, Gareth. It's really a pleasure to join you on the show and be able to share some of the insights I've built up with your listeners. So going back all the way to education, I guess you could say I've had a conventional start with an unconventional end. I went to university at Cambridge University, studied natural sciences, which means that you get to pick and choose what interests you and really let your imagination go wild. I started off doing biochem, ended up doing experimental psychology, which meant I got an early exposure to the application of some fairly new technologies at the time, like neural nets, like machine learning, in the context of kind of human systems, and that was quite a fun thing. It got to the end of uni though, and you spend all of this time being told to be imaginative, follow your dreams, and be creative, and then get this weird contrast where you're told on careers day that the way to be creative is to be a management consultant or a banker or something like that, and all of those sounded incredibly unappealing. So rather than jumping into any of those, I did some soul searching, I guess, and ended up with making chocolate. That sounded like the best thing in the entire world. For about 2 years, I sold chocolate at market stalls, made it out of my flat, did event catering, all these sorts of things where it was very, very much about like putting a tangible product into people's hands. But I realized after that time that if I wanted to take this kind of seriously and be full bore about it, it would require getting capital, getting a backer, and at that point the product becomes not so much my own. And also, I realized I had very little experience in business at that point. A friend introduced me to some people at Streetcar, which was an interesting startup at that point in the UK, doing a car sharing model similar to Zipcar in the US, and really hit it off with the team and thought, okay, this is a chance for me to gain some business experience, think more about the wider context of how to operate and run with a startup. If I want to, I can do this for a bit, and then great, I can jump back into a food business later. It didn't happen exactly as planned. I ended up staying at Streetcar as they were acquired by Zipcar, as they floated, as we acquired a number of other companies for a total of about 8 years. Taking on a number of different roles, starting in marketing, realizing that no one was any good at measuring anything. So getting up to scratch with a bunch of analytical techniques and teaching myself how to build analytic stacks actually in kind of a real life environment, which then led itself into leading a team which covered not only the analytics for that part of the business, but also revenue management, optimization of different logistic components of the company, and really covering off the financial planning for a large part of it, which is a career I never kind of fully envisaged for myself. Also got me into this very interesting cycle of transitioning from being a person who builds stuff and makes things into someone who's actually looking after a team and kind of creating a set of shared values and objectives for a number of people whose talents were really diverse and different from my own. It got to about 2 years after an acquisition of Zipcar by Avis Budget Group. And that was at the point where I started kind of reassessing and thinking about my career again. I'd done all of these different things. I'd led all of these different teams and had exposure to a number of different parts of the business, and was thinking, okay, the pace of this has now changed. The scale of ambition has changed. We're not about necessarily transitioning mobility and transforming kind of urban lives at this point. It's more about how do we synergistically enable Avis Budget Group, the person who had acquired, or the company who had acquired Zipcar at the time, to really leverage and make the most out of their assets and kind of create an effective, publicly listed car rental company. And that was not necessarily as appealing as the let's build something, let's get started, let's do it all from scratch kind of approach, which we had previously. This was about 4 years ago at this stage, and I was introduced to the CFO of Deliveroo, which was really taking off at that point. It's something which I obviously feel a lot of passion for as a natural foodie, and spending a whole bunch of time thinking maybe this is when I can go back and start my food business.
So sorry to stop you, Will. How did you get introduced to the gentleman in question at Deliveroo?
Oh yeah, was a friend of a friend. Simon Pinner, I believe, was the Simon Pinner made the introductions. We'd met before, actually talking about recruitment for like people externally into Zipcar. And actually, he said, I've got someone I think you really, really should meet. Why don't you come and say hi to Phil? It was especially interesting because there wasn't a role available. There wasn't even a kind of plan. It very much started as kind of informal meeting. And maybe this shows the tenor of kind of Deliveroo's culture at the time. But I deliberately wanted to pick a place which aligned well with the informality and creativeness I like, the informality and impromptuness that I like in a working relationship. So deliberately picked a place which not only served coffee, but transitioned nicely into cocktails in the evening. We, immediately when I met Phil, we had a really great connection. We sat down at about 4ish in the afternoon, had a couple of cups of coffee, which very quickly transitioned into, a couple of nice drinks. And we chatted for hours and hours and hours. It became very clear after that point. This was a team I really want to be involved in, a business which I really want to be involved in. And the more I met of the team, the more I kind of felt that passion and energy come off them and really got me excited about the place.
Oh, brilliant. Well, okay. Well, there's a lot to unpack there, Will. Okay. So I want to rewind back to the very beginning. Okay. Just to generally glaze over what you said and dig into certain points, because I'm interested in milestones here. And you've had a couple of really big milestones in your career, but let's go back to the beginning. You did a psychology degree, yeah?
Yes.
Which is very interesting. Obviously, I made the mistake at the beginning of making an assumption that you'd come from more of a technical background, but that's obviously not the case. You're just like, funnily enough, I did a single honours history degree, okay? And whenever people say, well, what do you learn doing a history degree? That, you work in tech, and I say, well, what I learned in the history degree is that people are inherently unreliable, sources are inherently unreliable, and you've got to take you've got to question everything in terms of, what I used to see history as factual. It's not factual at all. You're relying on sources, of extremely biased sources at that, So that's what I took forward into my career. But I mean, interested to know, in terms of psychology, what did you learn? What lessons did you learn from that period of academia that served you well through your career in analytics and senior management as you are doing now?
Absolutely. So I think psychology is really interesting, and I've often been accused of being like a bit snobby about it because it's something where people often make the assumption this is about relationships or the softer side of science, whereas actually in my opinion, it's kind of one of the hardest forms of science, because you're trying to draw statistical and real inferences out of incredibly messy data. The same as what you're saying about history. The talent of being able to kind of look at these incredibly varied sources and sources of unreliable quality and quantity, and draw valid conclusions from those things is something which is not practiced to anything like the same extent in some of the harder sciences. But that's probably the most important skill that you can have in a business context. The data which you have are rarely presented in clean forms. The behaviors of people in the marketplaces are rarely done through like perfect experimental conditions. And actually working out how you can still create quality representations and quality understandings out of those things relies on like a very, very detailed body of knowledge and statistics, as well as a good understanding of human nature. And both of those things play incredibly well together when it comes to actually transferring those skills into a technical marketplace, essentially.
Absolutely. I think those skills are going to become more and more valuable as automation takes hold more and more, if that makes sense. I think, do you know what I mean? The human element and the bits that the machines can't do, I think that's super important.
Absolutely. I think this is something we might touch on a bit later when we talk about some of the future evolution of the industry. But I think such an interesting trend is actually the introduction of tools and breaking down the barriers which previously required highly technical knowledge to be able to facilitate. You look at how much effort it would take to create a database 10 years ago. The standard was relatively high. Now it's something you can do with a few clicks. You look at the data integration technologies you can see, and how you pull data sets together. Same thing is true. You look at the packages which you can install, whether that be just, hey, I want to boot up Jupyter Notebook and import like scikit-learn, or whether that be actually the kind of public availability of tooling like TensorFlow or Facebook's Prophet. All of these things are essentially breaking down the technical barriers to being able to have an impact with data. But what none of these things can replace, essentially, is that human essentialism in that problem, where you need to know what it is you're trying to work out. You need to know whether the tool which you're using is appropriate or not. And you need to have that understanding of the mechanics of the world to know if you're creating a network which is going to have a effect which you desire, or something which is going to spiral out of control in a way which you don't like.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you have to maintain control, don't you? But I mean, that's a really interesting point, Will. I've interviewed quite a few people now doing this podcast, and there's a couple of things, because I always ask them for advice for the listeners, and advice for business owners, advice for people who want to develop a career in tech, and so on and so forth. And there's a couple of consistent messages that keep coming up. And one of them is certainly in the conversation around product development and product management, or product creation, I should say, is probably what this is most relevant to. It is to, when you define a problem, you need to literally work, find the problem, solve it, and then work back from that point to where you are now, and that's your map. Whereas so many people make the mistake of having a bit of a hazy vision. And successful ones, I interviewed Henry Moisenack, who set up iBazaar, who got acquired by eBay. They were essentially the competitor of eBay in Europe, and he was saying this. He was in Facebook, working alongside Zuckerberg when they were pushing the mobile platform, and really took the step up for Facebook. And he said Zuckerberg was all about this. It was all about solving the problem, and then designing the roadmap of how they're going to get to where they need to be. Off the back of that is working back. They start with the end in mind. It's the Stephen Covey concept, isn't it? So yeah, it's interesting that you should say that. I just wanted to move on to the next stage of your journey then, Will, which was you dipped your hand in immediately into being an entrepreneur straight out of uni, not messing around, and I set up my own business, obviously doing something that you were quite passionate about, clearly. Tell us about that experience. What did you learn from doing that?
Yeah, I think it was honestly the most valuable thing I could have done coming out of university. I thought at the time this was maybe just me like having a bit of a dalliance with something for pure fun reasons. But I realized it set me up in a very different way to a lot of my peers and colleagues. Having that responsibility from the start, where you have to take control of everything from your supply chain through to your marketing, through to your point of sale, through to your waste management and cash flow. All of those things were an immediate crash course in business, the likes of which you don't really get an overview of until you progress in an organization quite far. But more than anything, it was kind of a sense of responsibility for those things, and a sense that actually I can do any of those things. You start initially because you're forced to, but if being a fresh graduate and told build a P&L, or being a fresh graduate and being told create a brand, if you're doing that in a business context, you're held back by a lot of preconceptions, a lot of strings, a lot of worries that, like, can I do this thing or not? If you're doing your own business, you have to, because if you don't, no one else will. And that simultaneously is quite challenging, but at the same time very freeing. It gives you this very clear idea that the barriers which kind of hold you back are a lot based on kind of mental perceptions of what you can and cannot do, and also the value of just getting things done. If you have a thing, it doesn't matter if it's kind of crap. The fact is that you've got yourself from that 0 point to that 1 point, and that's often the hardest thing in kind of business and personal development. So yeah, love that, and I think it's something I'd recommend to, like, as many people as have the appetite for it.
I noticed you used the 0 to 1 analogy. Did you read the book by Peter Thiel on called 0 to 1, which is his take on how a startup needs to sort of build momentum?
I haven't actually, but I think I've absorbed a fair bit of it through osmosis, just because people talk about it in the context
right.
of where I'm useful in an organization. There have been lots of points in a company both in Zipcar and in Deliveroo, where going from that we have nothing to at least now we have an idea, we have a process, we have a thought about how we do this, has been a challenge that we've been facing, and having the lack of shame to say, hey, I can go and I can do that, and putting myself into that position has been a great career accelerant, as well as, I think, or at least I hope, something that's added value to the companies that I've been in.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's go back to sort of serendipity then. You obviously, this opportunity came your way to join Zipcar. Was it Zipcar?
Streetcar, but then it became Zipcar fairly soon afterwards as we were acquired.
Right, of course. So it came up with Streetcar. I got you. Okay, so you went in there to do marketing initially. Then is that right?
Yeah, exactly. So the thought was I've been doing all of this direct to consumer sales, essentially from like manufacturer through to the end interface. This is a great thing to kind of think about in terms of local execution of marketing. So it's like, this is a useful way of thinking about marketing strategy, a useful way of thinking about execution of kind of hyper-local campaigns. It didn't actually turn out like that in the end, because I did a bit of that project management and execution. But I, you can speak again to maybe to this serendipity point and to the 0 to 1 point. I was fortunate in that no one was really doing measurement in a very effective way in that. And my boss at the time, Jonathan Thompson, who was one of my good friends from university, actually, we'd both been on a lot of these same courses thinking about the quantification of uncertainty and the structure of it. And it very quickly evolved from this purely executional role to, hey, how do we think about the quality of marketing that we're doing? How do we start to quantify these pieces of uncertainty? How do we actually construct a analytic framework for these things? And again, speaking to the 0 to 1 point, I'd never even heard of what a marketing mix model was, or what like an attribution model was. It didn't stop us building a regression model, which actually like had a reasonable amount of predictive power, and it turns out that actually it is something which people in the industry do consider as a highly valuable piece of kind of insight. But it was great to be able to be in a company that was that young and that experimental, to just kind of play around and find that we could do these things.
No, absolutely. I think what was that transition like, going from doing sort of setting up your own venture, doing a marketing role, and then all of a sudden you're looking at complex market mix modeling and econometric models or something. It's you were thrusted into sort of mathematics and the murky world of statistical analysis. Did you just take that in your stride? Was that easy for you, or did you take a while to make that adjustment?
Yeah, I mean, in a lot of ways, it was a return to some of the things which I'd done in academia. So it was quite nice in that the techniques we were applying were a lot similar to the ones that you see in experimental philosophy, experimental psychology. The problems of kind of understanding these models were things which are kind of not too dissimilar from analytic philosophy. Everything which seemed kind of disparate in the past when I'd been reading up on economics or delving into maths or stats suddenly had a business purpose. So it actually became easier at that point to learn and apply things than ever had been learn them in kind of abstract terms through academia without that kind of real world application experience. So it was nice to return to things which I'd semi forgotten in a context where they actually mattered.
Well, that's the application of your knowledge, I suppose, isn't it? You
Exactly.
get tangible sort of feedback from all that knowledge you acquired in university, I suppose. Okay, so you stayed in the business intelligence data analytics world until obviously you joined Deliveroo. You were doing it there, and then August 2018 comes around, and you're thrust into this illustrious job title of Chief Information Officer, and at the helm of one of the most well-known delivery brands in the UK. So talk us about that. Talk us through that transition, and how did that opportunity come around?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you say, it sounds like a very illustrious thing, and I was very humbled to have the opportunity to kind of step into something like that. I think it speaks again to the serendipity of being in the right place at the right time, and also the willingness to tackle things which are not historically things which you felt comfortable with. That feeling of uncomfortableness is so important in creating that opportunity. So in Deliveroo, to start off with, I came in into this kind of undefined role, as I was saying with Phil, and this initially started off with doing some analysis and building up some tools myself. Eventually transitioned fairly quickly. I think it was in the first 6 months or so. Transitioned to looking after the business analytics team, the people looking after the data science for the organization, for all of the teams who are involved in commercial decision making. And this was great because it kind of allowed me to take a whole lot of the learnings which we put into practice in Zipcar into this new company, changing the thought process for the team from being we are providing data and we're doing analysis to actually forcing them to think about themselves as kind of empathetic business partners, and thinking, as you were saying before, about that kind of solution first approach. What is the effect that I want to create in the business, not what are the tools or what are the processes that I want to kind of take out of it. And this resulted in us actually transforming the way that data was used in a number of different decision-making points in the company. I think there was recognition at the time that hey, this was an interesting and nice transition. Wonder what else there is that we can throw Will at, and this position was thought about internally. Basically, when it was realised that we had not put the structure and the rigor onto a number of processes which we would need to have to be a mature company, to be a grown-up organisation. Things around information security, things around third-party application architecture, things around IT practices and standards when it came to individual tooling and personal computing for people in the organization. All of those things didn't really have a home and an owner, and they needed a place to kind of live in the organization. And so when the challenge came along, I immediately stuck up my hand and said that sounds like a great thing to do. It's been a really interesting 2 years almost taking on that role, getting a chance to learn about enterprise architecture and a lot of the things which I hadn't really appreciated on the back end, as well as having that front end appeal. It's been interesting as well for the purposes of kind of developing as a leader and as a manager, because I think the team at its peak was about 100 people, which is more than the amount of folks who I can keep in my head and have a good mental picture about what their personality traits are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and how they'll play individually with others and with individual projects. And it starts to get to the point where you have to think about management principles and categories of people. And as well was my first time, I suppose, managing people where I knew that they were wildly better at my job than wildly better at their job than I could ever be. In the past, I'd always tried to recruit folks where they had things which they could do much better than me. That's one of the most important things of being a leader is making sure that your team is significantly better at all the stuff that they're doing than you are. But this was a new experience for me, actually having the position where if you thrust me even into a junior role in information security, I would flounder for sure. But we were building up a team and kind of trying to set a vision for that group. So it's a very powerful leadership journey and one that I'm incredibly appreciative that I had the opportunity to kind of explore.
But it's so true though, isn't it? A big part of leadership is having a good recruitment strategy, I suppose. But I mean, what else have you learned about leadership during this time?
Yeah, so I think the other challenge which I definitely immediately face, and it's kind of similar to the other one. Sorry, I'll start again. The challenge which I think I face, which is similar to managing people who are wildly more talented at their role than you are, is the knowledge, the ability to kind of demonstrate and put your people's work to the fore when you're not even close to a subject matter expert in the area. It's a super important thing for leaders to be able to be an advocate for their team, to be able to be a champion for the good work which their team is putting in. And I'd always had a strong command of subject matter coming into it previously, which means being able to represent the work. You have that background, you have that body of knowledge. Not having that body of knowledge, but working out what the best way to be an advocate is, and working out what the best way to educate that team on being advocates for themselves was a very interesting set of challenges, I think.
Yeah, no, I can imagine that being difficult. I mean, I remember I go back, quite a few years ago when CIOs were quite, what would you call it, a rare breed in the UK? Because obviously the C-level exec thing is more of an American thing. And years ago, you used to just have IT directors and they looked after the whole technology function. And then, you'd have the finance director who would sit alongside them. I'm showing my age a bit now. But I remember, the reason I'm telling you this is because I remember asking a senior IT executive, a senior technology executive, what is the difference between a CTO and a CIO? And he said that, and he gave me this analogy, and I suppose it's shaped the way I've looked at it from now on, is that the CTO is inward looking and the CIO is outward looking. And that's the way I've always thought about it. That may be incorrect. And I'm talking in very general terms. Obviously, every organization is different. Would you say that's representative of your role? Did you take on this forward-thinking, outward-looking? We talked about all of the recruitment and the leadership stuff as well. But I mean, did it feel like that kind of pushing the company forward from a technology perspective?
Okay, that's super interesting as a distinction, because we at Deliveroo we have both a CIO and a CTO, and the distinction we have is almost the inverse, where because we're a technology company, we have been from the start. The CTO is primarily outward facing, in as much as our products are creating the things which people use in the marketplace. The role we're missing was actually how technology impacts the individuals who we have in our organization. And so whilst we had put so much thought into our consumer-facing tech stack and put so much thought into the design and flow of the products which we were constructing for people outside of the organization, we hadn't put anywhere near the amount of thought into what is the system architecture for third-party pieces of our platform? How are we enabling the employees that we have to act in the most productive way possible? How are we thinking about the kind of the security of our organization and the effectiveness of like our policing policies? Not to say that none of that is outward facing, because actually quite a lot of it is by its nature outward facing. But more, I think the distinction for us is about this kind of split between consumer-facing products and things which make the organization effective and work better. Hence the tie-up with the data science and business analytics angle, where it's a group of people who are fundamentally embedded into some of the most interesting pieces of technology, I think. But their job is not necessarily to serve the consumer. Obviously, it's there to improve consumer experiences in their product, but the primary customer is the people or are the people in the organization who are making decisions, are the people who you're trying to make better at their job by doing yours effectively.
Yeah, setting an example, and that makes total sense. Well, okay, let's move on to the next one then. Lots changed recently. We've got a big lockdown. We're coming towards the end of that now, but I mean, I think it's changed a lot of things for good, hasn't it? I mean, from a leadership perspective, what are the big shifts for you? You know, are you going to have more remote working as embedded in the culture from here on in? Has your style changed in terms of the way you manage people? What's changed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one thing which sets us in an interesting position as Deliveroo is, as you said, a lot of these changes are going to be ones which are happening potentially for good, and that's a scary proposition in a lot of ways. But for us as a company in a very innovative space, and who's always thrived on kind of pushing forward interesting and new consumer ways of interacting with food, having this shift means a rapid change in the challenges that we're facing as well on a day-to-day basis. Some of those may be bad, but actually a lot of the people who we have in the organization are those ones who will respond to that challenge and think about it in a very motivated way. The idea that there is a thing that we can do today versus tomorrow, and it matters that we do it. It matters that we do it today is actually very, very motivating for a large portion of kind of our workforce. So that immediate sense of the work which we do has a huge impact on the future of the company and the future of people in this crisis is incredibly motivating, and was very important to kind of get across to the team and kind of get everyone feeling they had a sense of purpose in this mission. On the more practical side, as you say, like going into lockdown means everyone is immediately remote 100% of the time. We're lucky in a lot of cases that we were operating across multiple offices for a lot of our operational work, and everyone is very comfortable with technology, and we had a stack which was very much enabled that remote working culture from day one. But it's one thing to kind of have the technology tools in place, and quite another to have the actual working practices and culture which goes along with it. There's been 100% a need for more structured communication, more open communication, more conscious communication, because the natural connection you get from people just from being in the same building and bumping into people in the kitchen or going out for a coffee is something which is intrinsically important to the cohesion of teams and organizations, but is not something which happens if you're kind of shut up in your different houses on each day. So thinking about what structures you can put in place to replace that unconscious and incidental communication with structured team rituals, with structured communication, with openness, which kind of cuts across a number of channels, has been really, really important. It's been interesting to note as well how much we've transitioned away from mixed styles of communication to consolidating on Slack more than anything else. At least in the tech part of the company. It's certainly become a lot more of a communications hub and a lot more of a repository for some of these incidental chats than it ever was before. And I'm really glad that we're doing this this year rather than 5 and definitely 10 years ago.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Do you know, I was reading something recently called the water cooler effect, and it just is relevant to what you said there, which is one of the most difficult things to replace when you're a total remote working team is some of the best, most productive conversations you have are completely spontaneous next to the water cooler. That's just the analogy, but I mean, it could be next to it could be standing in line for the coffee barista in WeWork, or it could be, you know what I mean? It's those spontaneous conversations which often yield great things, you know what I mean? And it's difficult to replace that, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So trying as much as possible to kind of create those moments of spontaneity, those kind of water cooler moments. You only get that through kind of regular catch-ups without fixed agendas, essentially. So, with my direct reports, we'd have catch-ups, I think, was it 3 to 4 times a week, with no particular fixed agenda. And actually, specifically, sometimes it would be to address particular problems. But if it wasn't there, being able to catch up and talk informally was actually an important thing. We've also got plenty of things like virtual coffee breaks where people can drop in and drop out depending on who's available and who's free. We've done a few virtual movie nights where everyone goes on simulcast with Netflix and you can have like a bit of a shared team experience. We do virtual drinks on kind of Fridays where you can grab a beer or a non-alcoholic drink of whatever sort you want and sit in your garden and just have a chat.
Yeah.
But yeah, trying to have at least some semblance of those day-to-day rituals in place has been really, really important. And actually, I think the last thing is something we didn't cover in the career progression side of things. But my role in the company is actually starting to change. We're having a discussion about this now, as a lot of the pieces that we have of this traditional CIO stack become more mature. They're actually a lot better placed in different parts of the organization. We transitioned quite a large number of them over to people in our platforms group, people in the rest of the tech team, it's about 6 months ago now. And I've actually gone back and been thinking a lot about how I can be an individual contributor and start coding again directly rather than having this kind of overarching management role. So it's a really interesting part of leadership, I think, and something that's also come back through in the kind of the communication style, because the kind of points of connection. Because one of the most interesting things you can do as a leader for a team, I think, is provide people with inspiring work. And what better way to be inspiring at that than doing it alongside with them in a less formal and less directive kind of way? Yeah,
absolutely. I think getting in the trenches and leading from the front is probably one of the best things you can do from a leadership perspective, isn't it? I mean, that's what really gets people on board with what you're doing. They're more likely to respect your opinion than when you are sort of giving them advice and things like that. So no, that's a great idea. Well, I think that's, I'm sure that will be very fruitful and very beneficial to your team in general. Okay, let's move on to the future then. So what technology innovations are you curious about or excited about right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've touched a bit already on the democratization to barriers to code, which I think is really interesting as a trend. And it's a repeated pattern that we've seen a number of times with technology in general. Like if you 30 years ago, you have the guy who can use the computer in the office, because it probably was a guy as well, and that was the barrier. You think back 20 years, and it's like, okay, there is a guy who can make the model in Excel, which you're using. You think back, 10 years, and it's like, okay, there's a person who can construct a website or build a database. And slowly, each of these pieces are being kind of broken down, and you're now getting to the stage where actually give it a few years, and the barriers to kind of create something fairly dramatic will be significantly lowered. And I'd like to hope that that's paired with an education system which prepares people to use those tools effectively, fingers crossed, which really speaks to this kind of democratization of kind of the tools which have historically been the playground of a very small group of people. So whether that be machine learning platforms we discussed before, like TensorFlow, it's pretty exciting. Whether that be the platforms which allow you to productionize code and productionize data science platforms like SageMaker with Amazon. Whether that be even on the very, very front consumer side, like the explosion of Squarespace in creating kind of beautiful front ends for people's projects, or anything in between. All of these speak to kind of breaking down the historic barriers and kind of creating a much more open future where anyone can build anything.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, look at this. This is a podcast. I set this up. Me and a few people in B Digital set this up relatively easily. This because of the platforms that are available. If we wanted to make audio content 15 years ago, the only way I could do it is by getting a job with the BBC or independent, production company. Do you know what I mean? So yeah, I think you've raised a really good point there. I mean, the democratization of content creation, of creating software, creating anything really is got to be a good thing, and it's surely going to accelerate human progress in general, isn't it?
Absolutely, and kind of paired with that is this. As well as the accessibility for individuals, it's really interesting to see the trend of kind of companies considering more of the full vertical stack of what's available. Obviously, it's interesting for us as Deliveroo, where we kind of think first about the kind of direct delivery to consumer side of things, but then there's also deepening the relationships with the restaurant partners. There's also, helping on procurement, helping on staffing, thinking about how all of these things start to stitch together. But as you were kind of saying with the kind of end-to-end production of audio content or video content or any sort of consumer entertainment, you've equally got more and more industries kind of thinking, okay, how do we think more about the holistic picture? Whether that be clinical care and medicine actually going more hand in hand with lifestyle health. Whether we think about that as like brands which are getting involved in the kind of direct consumer sales rather than going through wholesalers or kind of resellers and kind of owning more of that manufacturing chain. Or whether you think about energy production in a decentralized grid where you have people having the potential to generate electricity in their own homes and actually be part of a kind of holistic system for moving energy and capacity around a distributed system. All of these things are incredibly interesting.
Absolutely. Are you interested in cryptocurrency?
Yeah, to a certain extent. That's actually a very, very good example of the decentralization as well. I mean, it's a classic example of decentralized authority more than anything else.
Yes,
because currency only has value by shared agreement.
Consensus. That's the only thing that makes it valuable, isn't it? Really, exactly. Unless you're bartering in crucial things like air or food or something, then that has other value, obviously. But apart from that, everything is consensus. So
exactly.
Why not?
As well with, or maybe even more interesting, I find really interesting about Bitcoin as well, which is you're seeing the price. You had obviously the explosion of price, but you're seeing it trend more and more closely to the effective cost of production in terms of raw energy output.
Yes.
Which almost makes it kind of this idea that it is a currency which is pegged to the value of energy, and ultimately, like every business and every system which we have globally is like a different variation of like capture energy, make stuff. If energy actually becomes your currency in that, it's a very pure articulation of kind of what what all industries are kind of doing essentially, whether that energy being used to make a kind of symbol of trust, whether that energy is used to power your home, whether energy is being used to manufacture a product which you can tangibly hold. All of them kind of speak to this very, very same base mechanism.
Yeah, well, I could talk about this all day, but I'm mindful of time. I know you've got a hard stop coming up, so let's just move this on. But yeah, so just going back to yourself, and I'm just keen to find out what's kind of you've had this amazing career trajectory. I think I'd be really keen to find out what sort of makes you tick and what you do to keep yourself on top of things, keep your learning progressive, you know what I mean? Keep constantly improving and constantly pushing yourself. So maybe to give you a bit more of a succinct question around that subject, what person, book or story have you been inspired by, which you think about, quite often, or something that that's guided you through your career?
Yes, I think there's an interesting principle in this where a lot of people say, oh, wow, I read this business book, or I read like this person's story, and this has been really exciting, or really influential. And actually for me, I read a bunch, and I listen to a bunch, and I watch a bunch, but I make sure that the things themselves are like sufficiently diversified. Always reading about, I'm just going to stay on top of it. I'm going to read the news every single day. I'm going to read, every article which comes out on this website. Like it creates more of an internal monoculture in yourself. So thinking when you're picking something up, even if it has no relevance, or especially if it seems to have no relevance, it can be the most important thing. And actually, I've got a great book recommendation which I'd encourage all your listeners to pick up.
We love a good book recommendation, Will. Fire away.
Yeah, it's a sci-fi book called Babel 17, written by Sam Delaney, really influential black sci-fi writer from the late 60s, early 70s. So you can imagine what it's like being in that kind of subcategory in that era in America. And the book itself is about language, which again is an unconventional topic for a sci-fi novel. And it's this idea that language itself can be a tool or a technology and can shape the way that you can express yourself and think. This idea was like incredibly beautiful to me when I heard about it the first time. And it's a a really important illustration for how narratives and language can be just as restrictive or as empowering as any physical effects. I think it's in a lot of ways a beautiful concept and a really important idea, especially in the context of the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that we're seeing currently in the US.
That's a great one. I mean, yeah, I think there's so much to unpack there. But I mean, just to pin on to one thing that you mentioned, yeah, I think I've not really ever had this conversation with anybody, but it's something that I have thought about myself, that language is not just the framework of what you say, it's also the framework of what most people think. Mm-hmm. And if we could think beyond language, then we probably open up lots of possibilities that we didn't know were there. Does that make sense? I don't want to sound like a philosopher, but but it is as a framework, and it's restrictive as way, because it's not, sometimes it's not completely, you can't express yourself because the language isn't correct to do so. Does that make sense, Will?
It makes 100% sense. That is something I think about a lot, and actually I think is maybe a key piece of advice I kind of give to to folks thinking about interesting ways to kind of expand their mind, the frame of mind, or kind of opportunities which are available. Is language itself is restrictive. Being able to learn more languages is really good, and actually it's why I'd recommend everyone learn how to code at least something, even though we're going to have tools to democratize everything, because actually having that ability to express things in a different language, a computer language, gives you access to a different set of frames and concepts, in the same way as being a great artist or being able to play music or being able to speak another human language gives you access to different concepts.
Absolutely.
And having that ability to flex between those things gives you access and perspective, which is very, very hard to have just from speaking in English and just from thinking in one form the entire time.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I couldn't agree more. I think that's brilliant advice. Let me finish on this one then, Will. I'm going to wrap two questions into one here. Okay, so there's inevitably going to be a lot of cultural and practical changes in terms of the workplace, yeah, and the way we manage and the way we lead people. What advice would you give to technology leaders of teams, anyone who's looked up to as a leader? What sort of advice would you give in terms of the new post-pandemic situation that we're moving into? What's going to change, and what's the best way to lead to mitigate against negative things that would come from that change?
Absolutely. So I've said frequently to my team that actually I like a little bit of chaos. I think it's healthy. This might be a little bit more chaos than would be ideal, but kind of knowing that there is this kind of sea of changes which is happening means that some people will be fast to respond to them and some people will be slower. And being early to recognize what is happening and being early to pivot to that is one of the most important things you can do, and one of the most motivating things you can do for a business or for a team. And that means some easy things like going after positive new stuff, but also means some hard things like knowing when to give up on a thing which might have been working previously. I think some of the most challenging conversations people are going to be having are people expecting a return to what we've seen, or expecting a this has always worked in the past, therefore I'm going to keep on doing it. And actually having that willingness to accept, I can see a change coming, and I can see an opportunity arising, whether that be in the marketplace, in a team management style, in a recruiting tactic. Any of those things is kind of wide open for change at this point, and being at the forefront of that and being able to shape it is an incredible chance for you as a leader, and also an incredibly empowering thing for a team and a company as well.
Absolutely. I think having an agile mindset is it's just so important at the moment, isn't it? And just rolling with the punches, accepting that change is inevitable, and seeing opportunity in that change, I suppose, is what's going to differentiate people who excel as a result of this change. So good luck with your future endeavours. I didn't get to ask you about the NHS thing you were doing as well. You hit your target, didn't you? Hit 500,000 free NHS meals. That was brilliant. Well done on that one. I'm sure you were involved in that.
Yeah, it was a really, really important thing just to think about what we could do in the context of like the entire world facing challenges, and NHS being such an important force in kind of keeping the country going is the very least we can do.
Absolutely. Brilliant stuff. Thanks for your time, Will, and all the best and good luck with your future endeavours. Thanks for coming on the Tech Leaders podcast.